Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Sadie Schernicka, and I am the marketing specialist on the Alumni Relations team, and we're thrilled to have you joining us today. Before we get going with today's webinar, I'd like to go through a few upcoming events we have on the Alumni Relations side. If we can go to the next slide, perfect. First up, on March 29th, we have a speed networking event. This is an event with MBA students and alumni. So if you'd like to chat with alumni about, things like career advancement, leadership, or your MBA experience when you were a student, this is a great event for you. Next, on April 5th and 6th, we have a campus event, campus-wide. It is Day of the Badger, and this is the university-wide day of giving and celebration for UW-Madison, and we really hope that you support business on this day. It'll be super fun, so keep a lookout for that. And then next, on April 12th, we have our next Badger Executive Talk. Dean Samba will be sitting down with Dory McWhorter, who is the CEO of the YMCA of Metro Chicago. So that will be a really great event to round out our Badger Executive Talks for the semester. If you'd like any more information on those, you can go to business.wis.edu/alumni to see all of our upcoming events. Next slide, awesome, thank you. So for today, we have a few different ways of communication, but the main one that we'll be using is the chat. So if you see that circle, that is where the chat is, where you can throw things in there. And then we'll also be doing a Q&A at the end of the program. And so all those questions can just go right into the chat. So at this time, I'd like Sachin to join me on screen. Sachin Tooley brings over 15 years of teaching experience in his courses in international business and global marketing, which includes business and global economy and the global marketing strategy course. He's developed, taught, and led international business seminars to China, Cuba, India, Thailand, and Vietnam for graduate and undergraduate students, as well as for faculty. As the director of the international business major, he oversees curriculum, advises students, and ensures that the department is well represented here at UW-Madison. He's traveled extensively throughout Europe, Central America, and Asia. He holds a BBA in marketing and an MS in higher education administration from both the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So welcome, Sachin, and thank you for being here with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. The agenda for today is really a broad overview of these issues that come up with intercultural communication, and specifically through the international business lens. So I'd like to start off just making sure everyone understands what do I mean when I talk about international business, and then to think more granularly about the issues and why this idea of building international mindset matters. To be clear, this is really going to be high level because actually we have a 3-credit course on intercultural communication in the BBA. And so to try to distill everything we would try to cover in a semester down to 45 minutes or so, I'll do it my best college try, I guess they would say. And then we'll end kind of focusing in on a couple of intercultural dimensions that would come up specifically in the workplace, and close out with some Q&A. Hopefully we'll generate some good discussion there. So at the very broad level today, I think it's maybe hard to think about international business when there's a fog of uncertainty after the pandemic that we're still slogging through, geopolitical tensions, the onslaught of technology that is disrupting all sorts of industries. So I personally feel that though, given all that, the post-World War II New World Order that really contends that countries that trade together can have mutual peace and prosperity is largely going to remain intact. All countries, when they have uncertainties, they tend to go more insular. But the idea of why firms have pursued international business and globalization, I think that largely remains intact, and we'll see that coming forth after the pandemic and these current geopolitical tensions. So, just to refresh, why do firms pursue such global business opportunities? And part of it is that, there's a quest for new consumers, trying to enhance profitability, access to resources that just frankly don't exist within certain countries or within even larger regional blocks. Access to talent and innovations, hedging cyclicality, going closer in future markets to actually hedge against political risks by being local players who are aligned within countries and are aligned with the consumer mindset and also aligned with the governments. Of course, all business is impacted by international business to some degree, even if you don't have a footprint in other markets. Of course, foreign competitors may be contending your business domestically. So these are issues that all firms have to deal with at one level or another. So at the broad level, talking about culture, what do we mean by culture? What is culture? Where does culture come from? And what are some elements of culture? So of course, culture is at the most basic level, the system for living within a society. And the things that go into culture are obviously history, geography, technology, and political economy. And of course, that has probably been adapted through all sorts of things that the world has seen. Earlier versions of globalization meant that you couldn't invest in other markets openly and freely. You had to do that under the guise of governments and militaries. And so with that, the governments took different languages, different administrative structures, different legal foundations. And of course, that has manifested itself into cultures today. Those vestiges from history are still there today. And of course, social institutions, whether that be school, religion, media, government, that is something that's had impact on culture as well. So culture is very broad, therefore, but it's also important to realize that culture is not static, right? Cultures change over time, they adapt. And also culture is not just at the national level. Culture exists at a regional level, at a state level. It exists at the family and individual level too. So I think one big takeaway from today is going to be understanding culture with these nuances in mind. And in some respects, it's paradoxical. You have to consider that cultural differences are real and they exist, but you also have to realize that they may not always be an issue as to why communication is breaking down, and to use some best practices to limit the impact that intercultural communication barriers can at least bring about, to have more meaningful, more rich communications with your work colleagues and people who are assignees to you around the world. So, of course, these cultural differences can manifest for international business folks in two major significant ways, two major consequences. One is that, of course, consumers around the world, based on cultural differences, may consume products and services in different ways. And of course, that's really fascinating to discuss about in terms of why Uber is different in different markets, and why Oreos are too sweet in China but not sweet enough in India. We can talk all about that, but perhaps that'll have to be a different day. Today, we're really going to focus more on the idea of the communication pieces of intercultural differences and how that might affect getting the work of management. And it goes broader than just management. It's the idea that most firms, when they interact with other nations, they do so through intermediaries, right? Those could be suppliers, they could be distributors, they could be partners, meaning governments or other NGOs. And so this intercultural communication issue comes up, of course, with things like negotiations as well. So when we talk about culture, it's important to realize that culture has kind of components that are more what we'd say surface level aspects of culture that are explicit and easily observable. And then there's a non-observable and implicit aspects of culture. So, so some way people who study international business and intercultural communication like to think is that culture is kind of like an iceberg floating in the ocean. And here you can see a graphic of that, right? So you've got some things that are visible with the iceberg floating in the sea. And actually, some of these things that are explicit and observable tend to be things that people find quite malleable, right? Hairstyles, clothing trends, You can go around the world and see office parks full of buildings that look similar, and house maybe the same company names on them around the world as globalization has taken hold. But the underneath, right inside those office parks, underneath the surface, is actually where you as leaders, brands, as the voices of companies, need to actually connect with people, and there is where the cultural change goes slower, and you might see more differences in terms of how that idea of the society should exist gets manifested itself at a deeper level, and it's slower to change. And so I like to think about it sometimes where sometimes a surface culture are kind of norms and behaviors that people have, but then some of these things become so entrenched that they become laws, right? You go from this idea of this is kind of etiquette, and then the other one is below the surface is like, these are our values, and so this we're enshrining in actual law, and of course that moves slower, as just an example. So if you've been following the race to electrify, right, I think one interesting story I've been following is this idea of Volkswagen's head, Herbert Diess, and how he feels that Germany as a whole, and Volkswagen in particular, the firm he helms, is moving too slowly. And in Germany's case, this idea of automobiles is very important to the German economy, whether it's automobile assemblers themselves or the vast supply chain of component suppliers that are there. Automobile industry accounts for about 20% of German employment. And the firms themselves are organized slightly differently than we tend to see here in the US, where the board structures typically include local government representatives, such as from Lower Saxony in Germany, and actually more everyday workers are represented within the corporate structures. So obviously, German culture tends to be, and this is one thing I'd like to say about cultures and talking about cultures, and this is a very difficult thing to kind of talk about, because we have this idea of generalizations and stereotypes, right? So at the very onset, we have to understand that it's useful for we as humans to have information that we can categorize as knowledge to be able to act upon it, right? But because cultures change and because culture is diverse, we don't want to use stereotypes about another group of people and realize that that's somehow fixed and not malleable, or not that cultures don't also exist at the individual level. So in this case, though, it's broadly perceived, and you've seen other cases of this in the past, whether it be Daimler's acquisition of Chrysler back in the day, to other examples, but generally the German business culture and especially the auto industry moves much more methodically and slowly. This industry is quite entrenched within the nation, and of course they've established excellent brand names and that carry a lot of global value. And so you've got tensions within these firms about making sure they don't rush something that doesn't work well in their approach to this big shift that's happening broadly with electrification. But I find it kind of interesting that one of the ways I feel that Herbert Diess is pushing the mindset amongst his executives to kind of think more broadly and more agile is he keeps bringing Elon Musk into the fold on executive briefings and the shareholder types of conversations. And so I think it's his way of trying to communicate a different cultural value that might be the more freewheeling, entrepreneurial, and risk tolerance that maybe Elon Musk espouses a bit with how he's pushing the fold with Tesla. So I think it's kind of an interesting example of kind of this culture and cultural change, and using different pressures to accomplish some of the goals that you might have. As I mentioned before, I think after this pandemic and these next few years, we'll actually see more global mobility. It'll happen, of course, on the tourism front because we're all dying to travel again. But for firms, I think one big takeaway I have from the pandemic is how much we really needed globalization, right? I mean, obviously, we needed all sorts of things that we luckily were able to restore our supply chains with that got our day-to-day needs, but we're still reeling from supply chain shocks because it's just apparent our systems really rely on bringing things in from the rest of the world, and we're not actually handling all that well. And likewise, other countries around the world are waiting for things from our countries as well, such as vaccines and other things. Netflix to have something to bide the time while they've been cloistered at home. So in its PwC has a talent mobility report, and the last one really, kind of tried to get input from workers around the world to say, would they like to work outside their own countries in their career? And you see here that by and large, most workers around the world would want to have that experience of understanding and being closer and widening the worldview that global mobility brings. I think the pandemic has certainly brought us many years ahead in terms of everyday a person's ability to be fluent in technology, such as the one we're using here for this webinar. And so I think firms will obviously pivot and have adopted this approach to perhaps use global mobility solutions and assign people for work that maybe happens more on a remote basis, a more virtual basis. But so far, nothing really, I think, will replace fully going around the world physically and meeting people, face to face and interacting with that way. You just can't replace it, and people want it. And as the world continues to struggle, if you look at our economy in the U.S., we actually have a big talent shortage right now with the Great Resignation and some other facets. So firms need talent, and if your talent wants the global mobility, then that's probably something that you're going to have to offer. And so, of course, there's this need to have intercultural fluency. And I don't want to get too far away from the topic at hand, but of course, broadly speaking, if you consider yourself a US person, we've enjoyed the US, the ability to sell more into our internal market for generations because we had mass immigration coming into this nation. But now that we've cut that off for the last couple of decades to a great degree, when our companies want to expand, they're increasingly having to go and find that growth in foreign markets. So now companies like Apple, Qualcomm, not only technology companies, they find that more than 50% of their revenues come from global markets. And so there's a big imperative there to make sure that everyone from leadership down is able to be more interculturally fluent in their business dealings. Why is it hard to develop international mindset and adopt kind of best practices? One of the problems is that we have to realize that our brains are wired to discriminate, right? We come out at birth knowing just two things: warmth and cold, light and dark. And so from there, our brains work by creating nodules to take in new information, and our brains are kind of wired to take in new information and perceive it as different, and to assign a value to that difference. And so part of being a better internationally minded person, more interculturally fluent, is to realize that some of what you're trying to learn can't be taught to you. You have to learn it yourself. And these are very valuable things. Being able to be more comfortable with ambiguity, to build self-confidence, self-esteem, learning how to take care of yourself when you're experiencing dissociations or distress. And doing that to look after your own welfare, of course, helps you understand what other people may be going through. And that's what real empathy is all about. And then, of course, to be able to judge differences in a way that's non-judgmental, to appreciate those differences. That's really what a diversity is all about. International experience also has shown to perhaps enhance creativity. And if you have an economy like the US, where so much of our economy is driven by innovation, then you understand why seeing how other people solve their societal issues, their consumption needs, how they build their models for handling, let's say, things like ESG, may be very important as skills to bring to the table and for people to look for when they're considering a different applicant. And just to be clear again, there's kind of three major pillars. When we talk about our international business curriculum and building global business competency, we're looking at building within our students the idea that they are fluent in global business competence from kind of three major angles. One is you have to understand the countries that you're doing business with and how they may be unique in their political economy, in their legal system, what competitors are like in that nation, which trade blocs they belong to. Then, of course, there's just broadly cross-border transaction knowledge around the world in terms of how the Bretton Woods institutions function. What's the role of SWIFT? We're all learning that right now in the news. And how does SWIFT work? And what does taking a country off of SWIFT mean for that country and other countries who may trade with that nation, right? And then there's this piece about cross-cultural skills, which can include language. Negotiation happens differently around the world. And of course, this piece on just being a better communicator, which is our focus for today. So let me make a short break here to start some of this interactive piece here. So the first question I have for you, and you can respond in the chat, is what is this emoji mean? Okay, Brooke has chimed in and said happy. While you guys are thinking, see if anyone has a different opinion. I have no bottom teeth. I need some dental work. That could be one interpretation. My wife's a dentist, so I'm gonna pass that along to her, Seth. Thanks for sharing that. So Kevin has said artificial smile. John has said something positive, right? So I wanna step back for a minute and see if anyone understands or knows, where did adoption of emoji start? Does anyone know where emojis became a phenomenon such that then they were globally adopted? That's right, Kevin. So emojis come from Japan. And the reason I'm talking about this is because Japan is a culture where they value, as you can see on this chart here, a high amount of context in communication. And so in fact, as some of you mentioned, that you're not taking the same interpretation of this emoji. Generally in the US, we're a very low context culture. So we're now kind of bridging to talking about some big intercultural differences and how they can manifest themselves in communication. Obviously context is a big issue. And in other societies, this emoji is, as Kevin has pointed out, seen as much more of an artificial smile, kind of the obedient smile, a smile of being graceful perhaps to your supervisors, but not really sincere smile, because it's seen as there's other emoji options which involve more of the face when you smile. When you smile, a real smile, it takes, they say you smile with a lot of your face, your eyes, they kind of curve out, your cheeks bunch up here. So you smile with your whole face. This person's just smiling very at the surface level, right? And so one big part of kind of seeing how that was a necessity in Japan, that just sending short messages through text by SMS was not sufficient in that society, a society that really values having a more complete picture around what the sender of a message is trying to convey. And of course, in Japan, they use, and a lot of other societies, they use lots of other tools. And of course, a lot of this happens in a way that's unconscious to them, because it's been acculturated to that society. How deep someone's bow is, how important age or seniority or title in someone's role as presented on a business card, where they went to school. So in a lot of societies, high contextual communication is a lot more important. And here in the US, we're a low context culture. And as you can see here, but we've adopted this tool too. So I think one of the big takeaways from today in terms of improving intercultural communication is we've got these tools like Zoom that we're using now available generally almost at zero cost or very low cost. There's nothing to stop you from using higher contextual communication, and you should adopt that practice. Maybe it's a great tool for periodic check-ins. It could be your dominant tool that you use to communicate more, or it can be a great follow-up tool for communication with the people on your teams. And part of the challenge in the US, and we're gonna just scratch the surface here with a few of these differences, because I wanna make sure I leave time for adequate Q&A. But of course, a lot of intercultural dimensions of difference in the workplace, they kind of coincide with others. So in the US, one of the things we're not going to spend too much time on, but is that we're a real culture that views that time is very compressed. We think that time is linear. We think that time is very compressed. And so we want communication to be very efficient. And one way you do that is we just expect people to have the information be taken in its literal sense. And we don't pay too much attention, or I would say as much attention to other ways that people may be communicating around the dinner table, at a meeting, or just reading between the lines of what's said. And of course, they say, you can listen to TED Talks and other things where people say, even in the US, nonverbal communication is important, right? I know that from myself when I'm trying to tell our students how to be better presenters in the classroom. Get away from the podium. Don't use the podium as your shield. Don't use that fig leaf hand posture where you're kind of having your hands in front of you. Have your hands out and open and try to use them something. So even in the US, right, we feel that actually context and communication is important. We encourage people to understand how they are presenting themselves in the environment and how that's making a difference and how their communication is perceived. And it extends from their confidence to their competence. So what my point I'm trying to make is, in other cultures, if we're shown though here to be on this low context extreme, then you can understand how in other cultures that is also highly important. And one big takeaway from today is to make sure you're positioning yourself to add context to your communications. And of course, another piece is to communication is this idea of how, right? So context is one issue, but then the idea is the approach to the communication. And we have idioms in the US where we actually tell people, spit it out. We say, get to the point. And you can see that reflected here in this slide, where a lot of other cultures, that is not how they believe communication is ideal. Communication as a human activity should be perhaps more nuanced, perhaps more full of reconveying key messages, or making sure you're leaving time for side conversations and to gather input. So it gets multidimensional very quickly, but these are some important pieces to keep in mind. Another facet I'd like to talk about is this idea of how you build trust. And again, this presupposes, I think, as you start to understand these dimensions, you have to go deeper into understand why these things might matter. So in the US, we're a very task-based work culture. We believe that information is objectively available to everyone, and meaning we believe in kind of a social equality. We have this mentality, and again, there's things that cultures say, and there's the way that cultures are. So there's always things to filter. We have a society where we believe what we say is that people should be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Meaning, if you just work hard, then you have a large amount of say over your life's direction and trajectory, right? But what is under that? Under the surface of that sentiment comes some things such as a belief that merit somehow exists in our society, such that you have equal footing when it comes to education, you have non-discrimination, that you can trust in the legal system, that you have faith in that it's impartial, that there's low levels of corruption, right? So a lot of things goes in behind the scenes in terms of having this task-based orientation. Where other cultures, for instance, how communication is considered and the workplace is considered to really progress is not so much on the tasks. It's based more on the relationship. And I think these are important to consider because when you think about where, of course, most of global growth is going to be forecasted to go, we heard about these BRICS nations, Brazil, I don't know right now about Russia so much, India, China, we know Nigeria is there, South Africa, Indonesia, and of course, this chart doesn't have all these countries, but hopefully what you're seeing through some of these charts is that US culture, if you consider yourself a US acculturated person, US culture is very large cultural distance from a lot of these other places where a lot of future growth is forecasted to be taking place. So you really have to understand then that people take very different approaches to how they build trust, how they believe work is won, and what's most important with managing workplace relationships. It's not necessarily about the task. So, and I think one of the challenges that I was hoping to impart today is that people who understand intercultural differences and the challenges that presents in the workplace, they kind of have a dual job. Oftentimes you're sent or you're tasked with being the person facilitating these conversations and facilitating the management of work being done across borders. You oftentimes have to spend a lot of time educating your people back in the domestic environment, your superiors, about how the challenges may exist in terms of how business is won and how maybe just going after the task of being on the ground there is not sufficient. You may need more travel budget. You may need a longer window of time. You may need an expense account for hosting meals, so that you can effectively, build a relationship, and that's highly valued in other cultures. It goes from, again, below the surface to lots of different things. So, for instance, if you've ever been one of my students, you'll know the answer to this because it's a kind of a factoid I always share with my students. So you see here that India is a very relationship-based business culture. And I'll tell you one fact is that the Indian judiciary has before it more cases than it can keep up with, meaning that there's more cases in front of India's judicial system than the country can manage, and so a backlog has formed. So I'd like someone to perhaps in the chat share just the size that you think of that backlog. What size is the caseload in India's courts? How many cases are they behind on adjudicating? Kevin has come in with 10 million. Seems like a large number. Any other guesses? We got 1 million, tens of thousands, Nina? Yeah, so actually Kevin is correct. Not correct, but closest, but still an order of magnitude off. I think recent reports put the number at around 30 million, right? So there's 30 million cases. And of course, these are everything from divorce proceedings to other civil matters and commercial disputes as well. And of course, if it's something really serious that gets the media's attention, then that gets pushed to the front of the queue because the politicians don't want that to hurt their political ambitions. But the reality is that you can't really trust the courts in a country where that backlog is 30 million cases. And so what that means is that it's really important that you don't go to the court if there's a dispute, that you format the whole structure of business around doing business with parties that you can trust. And of course, that changes the whole legal profession. You go from hiring lawyers once you get into trouble, you hire lawyers at the front end to be kind of consultants who help you make matches with companies who have a great reputation as well, and to make sure those bonds happen so you keep yourselves out of court. Because court itself is subject to very long delays, as you see before you, to judges that can be bought off, or just the idea that you'll never see justice before the dispute is long forgotten. So you get a sense for how then these big pieces come into how business is done. And so of course, for the international manager, it's the idea of learning to oftentimes really spend the time, the energy, and advocate for yourself to have the resources to take more time building those relationships in person, or at least virtually, if that's what it takes, or that's what you're able to do. But it takes more time. And that's the one big consequence I wanted to mention for everybody in effective intercultural communication involves over communication, meaning communicating with greater intensity in multiple channels and more frequency. So disagreeing or confrontation, and I think one thing is seeing this in a negative context, disagreement. But I think broadly, more speaking, it's kind of about feedback, right? And so, of course, this is very a big issue because organizations that have diversity have been shown to have greater performance. And so you want multiple perspectives. But if those perspectives are ensconced in cultures where they're just the idea of saying no, or correcting or confronting a supervisor, it just can be difficult to elicit then those wider viewpoints that you may want to have. And so, of course, part of successful intercultural communication is to build knowledge, which we're trying to do here today to a degree, but then extend that to a strategy. So move from acquiring knowledge of these intercultural differences to then move to having a strategy around which you can say, well, I know this issue might come up where I'm just going to get yeses, but I have to understand what that yes means. Is it really yes because everyone believes it? Is it yes because it's a conditional yes? They really don't believe it, but that's what I'm getting back because that's what's polite. You have to figure out a strategy then to collect the information in different ways. Nina has said, why is the UK in the middle and why is the US in the middle too? I don't know exactly. It's probably very different reasons why. But one thing I can tell you about, one takeaway from today is to understand that cultures are very diverse, right? And so both the US and the UK are very diverse within their makeups in terms of the business and mentalities. And so probably you see quite a bit of difference. And I myself is part of that story, right? I was raised biculturally. I was born in India, but I was very young, 6 when my family moved to the US. And during the school days growing up, I was living in the US, but back at home, in the evenings, I was kind of like still in India, right? Because my parents had been acculturated their whole lives up until we moved here to the Indian way of thinking. And, that's the way I was acculturated at home. And so for me, though, there's certainly parts of my mentality in terms of how I think about myself in the work world that are very different, I think, from dominant US business culture. I was not taught to really self-promote. I was, the idea was for us, the respect for teachers, the respect for your educators, this kind of more hierarchy and obedience, and just doing hard work without sticking out was something that was really taught of, as something to be proud of. And so my point I'm trying to get to is that yes, probably there's regional differences, as Joseph is talking about here, but I also think in the US we have quite a few different people that are represented within the world of work from lots of different countries and lots of different backgrounds, and so you might be manifesting itself there where you see quite a bit of difference in terms of how people are perceiving this piece. That could be one aspect of it. Japan, for instance, is a country where they have a big demographic issue going forward because really they don't allow immigration, and it is very homogenous within the country. So part of it is culture, part of it is, I think, makeup of the workforce and how these things manifest themselves. So another facet that I think comes into this idea of trusting and relationship building and how people perceive their world of work with their ability to succeed is this idea of what we call locus of control, right? To what degree is someone's abilities and future trajectories going to be manifested by themselves being able to take control and ownership of their lives? And here you see that around the world, there's quite a bit of variance in terms of how people perceive that. And I'll give you a story from, again, going back to my family in a sense, but my sister-in-law manages a remote team in India. She's based here in the US. She works for a San Francisco tech company, San Francisco-based tech company, and she manages a small team of software engineers based in India. And one of the things, she's new to the role. She's been there less than a year, so new to supervising this team, which is her first team of global assignees that she's managing. And she has a training budget for these staff members, and so she went around and asked each staff member which training that they would like to take, and she got very little feedback, and she was trying to assess why no one was sharing with her openly, which training. And the software development field is really fast paced. There's always seemingly a new tool, a new programming language, new repositories and workarounds and frameworks to be. So you have to keep yourself relevant in a field that changes so quickly. But she found that they were not taking her up on her offer of additional investment in training. And it's almost like they wanted her to tell them which training to take. And so I think, this is this piece here that comes to this idea of locus of control. And I think part of it is she was new to the role. She was new as her supervisor. And so my advice to her was to try to think about then this idea of her point is, look, if I don't use this budget, then corporate's going to say we don't need it in the future. So if I don't use this budget, it may not be there again. So we should definitely take advantage of this. So my advice to her was she has to build more trust with these staff members, and to perhaps elicit that and to share her own. One good method for that would be to share her own training needs, so that maybe the idea of them disclosing they have some deficiencies might make her think that they're less than ideal workers, or they have some skills gap. And so I told her to be much more open about her own perceived feelings of where she needs to improve, and use that conversation around this idea of needing to spend the money to do it in a group way, and then use her platform for her sharing her own needs for training as a way to overcome this kind of cultural issue of them not wanting to be open about where they might feel that they have some additional training work to do. And of course, there's other strategies. There's no recipe here for effective intercultural communication. The idea is that you have to bring kind of sincerity and authenticity to what you're trying to accomplish. And that's the number one thing, is to be yourself. You can't it's not effective to try to pretend to be someone else. She can't adopt. She's never been to India. She can't adopt an Indian cultural manager. She's not going to instantly win them over. So she has to work extra hard at building that trust, building that relationship, so that they feel comfortable and see that as a meaningful relationship of mutual trust that's going to take the organization forward. So let me end here. I know I just have a couple minutes. I knew time would fly by with a few takeaways, and I've tried to intersperse some of these as we've gone along, and then we can open up for Q&A as well. So I think that it's very important, right, to understand that this is one facet of getting business done across the world is cultural issues. While cultural differences can exist, as I mentioned before, culture is also deeply personal. The world is diverse, the world is interconnected, and there's constant change. So I grew up in Indian culture at that time in the 1980s of being very much hierarchical and being much about diminishing this idea of self-promotion. And in a sense, I think that has a consequence of making sure it tends to quell self-confidence to a degree as well. So, but now, look at India today, and you've got close to several 100 million people on Facebook, and TikTok, posting tons of self-promotional content and seeing the world as revolving more around their individual self rather than the collective of their family and their family's relationship to society. So, the manager you may be dealing with in India may have spent, an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree in the US before moving back to India. And so they may very well understand where you're coming from. And of course, we're teaching about intercultural communication here in the US, but people from overseas are learning about US business culture, for instance. So these are some ideas to have in the back of your mind, but it's not necessarily to always overestimate the value or how culture might be in the way of communication. And again, I think it's very important to be yourself. When we think about you communicating with others, you yourself are a brand. And of course, when companies communicate with their constituents, the companies express themselves through brands. And what makes for a good brand? A brand has to have a story to tell. The best story for a brand to tell is its authentic story. It's to use its own voice. And so I think the nice thing about trying to be mindful intercultural communicators is it challenges you to be your best communicator. It's yourself, but with special attention to etiquette, openness, and inclusiveness in mind. The US ranks #1 in the world in terms of cultures who espouse the idea of confidence and individualism being very important. And when it comes to how other cultures perceive leadership and how they believe communication is done and what gives someone credibility, it doesn't always translate that the idea of being confident also means you're not automatically competent. And so I think it's very important to realize, and it's not something we prize well here in the US, is the idea that listening is actually a very powerful form of communication. And so you have to understand that being an active listener is something that cultures around the world are going to appreciate. That takes more time. It takes more time to gather feedback from others and progress in that manner. And so that's a consequence you have to keep in mind. So I think I've got that there with this idea of this greater investment of time. I've got a couple other slides here, and I know that we're going to be sharing this recording and these slides, I assume, with you all. So you can look at these with more granular detail on some pieces of how to improve intercultural communication when you're leading a meeting or a Zoom, and also on drafting email and other correspondence. So I'll end here with this also idea of something I brought up before, this idea of context, right? In the US, we use low context forms of business communication, such as email, but around the world, many cultures enjoy other, and they rely on tone of voice, nonverbal cues. So try to infuse in your communications around the world these face-to-face methods. Even if they're virtual, they bring forth these other pieces that may be very helpful in establishing a relationship, showing your true intention with your face versus just literal communication being written in email form, et cetera. So those are some best practices I'd leave you with now that we're kind of short on time. So we'll open up now to Q&A that you have.
All right. Thank you so much, Sachin. That was wonderful. A few questions have come in. First question, how do you avoid culturing past each other? Seth asks, as a US person, I'm trying to be sensitive to Chinese colleagues and adopt some of their norms, and the Chinese colleagues trying to be more like the US and end up crossing signals. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That's a really interesting anecdote or story about what's happening. I would say focus on the relationship. You know, when you go back to that PwC, why do people want to travel and spend time overseas? Is because I think they really want to understand better this human condition and enjoy the diversity of everything that's on this planet. So I would just focus more on the relationship to a greater degree and keep working past it. I think you know, you can't let the cultural issues necessarily stand in the way, and maybe you just haven't found your rhythm yet. I would have you can have a conversation around the miscommunication, right? Or trying to make sure you're being sensitive to how things are going. That's the piece I'm talking about with what we call over communication. You're communicating things in multiple channels, eliciting feedback through multiple ways, writing an email and then following up informally, and sometimes having to follow up informally through multiple channels within an organization. So I think best practices there are really to you know, and if you think about like whom your friends are in life, you've got a diverse group of friends, you know, that oftentimes have kind of different opinions and different ways of looking at the world. And so what keeps you together is that relationship, and you have that grounding to work back. So you know what you know, my friend is like this, that other friend is like that. And so I think once you have established that closeness, then you know you understand that that's the way this relationship works, and you know, finding a third way together of how you're going to conduct your business. That's what happens quite a bit.
Awesome, thank you. Anne mentioned that a few of your slides referenced Erin Meyer's culture map and asks, is her framework still the #1 go-to resource for intercultural business relations?
I would say that there's not a single go-to resource. Her work is some of the, I would say, the newest. The field of intercultural communication is only like a generation old. So it's a new field since the 1960s, really, this field of kind of assessing, and because that's where you saw this really big rise in global multinational firms taking hold. So Geert Hofstede, Fons Trampenaars, Erin Meyer, Edward Hall, these are all names that you could look at, and they all bring different aspects to the conversation and bring different ways of trying to define these cultural differences. I like Erin Meyer's work because her way of going through these dimensions, and that's what these different researchers and academics do. They see if they can find some other nuanced way of looking at cultural differences. I think Erin Meyer's work is one of the most fresh. So I've used that here, but certainly not the only resource.
Awesome, thank you. Joseph has a question. Do you have any suggestions about getting better at understanding the nuance of more textual communication? I know I struggle with this, but don't know how to get past it.
So Joseph, I'm guessing the word there was contextual, a contextual communication. So I think, again, I think the best thing you could do is to, like, again, because some of these things, they can be learned, but they cannot be taught. For instance, I like to watch a lot of world cinema, and I, you know, if my daughter or my wife is not Indian. Sometimes she just struggles with the accents. They're speaking English, but they're speaking English with a foreign accent, and she's just not used to it enough to understand the words that someone's saying when they're speaking with with an accent. So I think the same way with intercultural communication is by being on the ground or seeing it. When it comes to context, it's about what else is in the environment. So I think the best way to do it is to see if you can go to some of these places to see that firsthand. And if you can't, then I would encourage you to watch some films, watch some documentaries, and you can kind of live through or watch YouTube. You got a rich resource there that we never had before with self-generated content from around the world, and you could get really nuanced things that you're interested in, and see if you can pick up some of those pieces there.
That's awesome. Yes, I know that there's so many great resources out there that, sometimes we just got to write them all down. Another question is, what do you think is the best way to learn about the culture of an area when you're first starting to do business with that area?
Sure. Lots of different resources. I think one tool is, of course, I don't know how familiar everyone in listening in the audience is with this, but the U.S. government has a Title VI funding. It's called the Center for International Business Education Research. These are cyber grants, and over 24 institutions around the country have these cyber centers. And so the goal of these cyber centers is to basically increase U.S. business orientation with the opportunities and challenges of the world. And so some of these cyber centers have created intercultural repositories for people to get country guides, intercultural guides. And so what comes to mind right now is at Michigan State University, they have this resource that's called GLOBE. I can't think of what the acronym stands for, but you could look at GLOBE, and in that Michigan State resource will take you to many other links from there to see all sorts of things. So I think cultural differences is one piece. There are, I don't know if everyone's heard the term PESTLE. PESTLE is an analysis of a country based on political, economics, social issues, technology, legal system, and environment. And that's a great way, I think, for having a broad perspective on what are the things that are opportunities and challenges for the nation as a whole, and therefore kind of manifesting themselves maybe for change that's happening at that macroeconomic perspective. And then again, I think just watching more global media, global news can be very important. We have some pre-departure programs that we try to run for our students before they study abroad. That's exactly what we do. We have them start reading the news, start watching the media, and start reading some of these reports for the countries they're going to. At the very basics, the CIA has a World Fact Book, and you can look at a really brief synopsis of some of these issues, of course, through the lens of the US government on some of these issues, but you get a sense for some of the things, just as much as like which is the dominant religion, which languages are spoken, what's the current currency rate and inflation. All these things, manifest themselves in business to one degree or another.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is probably going to be our last question just because we're getting short on time here. But Alyssa asks, when communicating via email across multiple countries, is there a best practice in terms of approach, more direct, less direct?
Sure. I would say if you go back to my slides here on email communication, email is a very direct way of communicating. And so we have to understand that the reason everyone's adopted it is because it's so efficient. But because humans also are trying to be as efficient as possible, we may try to even be too efficient with this form of communication. So my suggestions are to be direct with email, but think about how you can use that email to do simple things that really go a long ways. Use a little bit of contextual communication within that, or build a relationship within email with showing somehow that your sincerity and having the right tone, and then breaking down pieces of the email. When I write, sometimes as an academic, I find myself trying to condense multiple things into one giant run-on sentence full of semicolons, and then I think, it also makes me look smart, right? But in reality, that is probably not a great way when you're trying to also deal with people who may not be as fluent in your language. We have this big privilege of oftentimes communicating in English, which we just assume is the language of business, which it largely is. But different people might be at different fluency levels with that. So try to break down things to smaller pieces, be more clear with expectations for what that each ramification of that action item might be. And then again, follow up. And part of following up well is to not ask yes or no questions. Ask questions that rely on the respondent to convey meaning back to you. So that's another best practice I would encourage you to consider.
Great, thank you. Those sound like some really great, helpful best practices. Alrighty, well, I think that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you all so much for joining us. I think this has been mentioned a few times in the chat, but we will be sending out a recording of today's presentation via email, so keep your eyes out for that. And we hope you enjoyed your experience today on Wisconsin.